So this is the Redstone Dancer. I think I'm quite interested in how I've really learnt a lot from doing this pose. Immediately looking at it, it's this very sturdy, big, robust kind of object. Like a few of Gaudier-Brzeska's sculptures, it seems to kind of come from a reference to, African art in terms of the abstraction, in terms of the kind of physicality of the sculpture. But there's lots of really strange things kind of going on, like with this arm that sort of stretches over the head and bends around onto the shoulder. And then this other arm that sort of creeps round. They're just impossible to do physically. So it makes you really think about the kind of sort of almost like supernatural quality of the sculpture and the pose. And then for me, there's this very kind of obvious thing about the physiognomy and the anatomy of the body. So like these breasts that are really kind of like, obviously not realistic at all, totally stylized, but again, how they become weirdly sculptural and sort of enmeshed. And I think there's one thing about, so when I was kind of doing the pose, really thinking about the stance, the legs, and the kind of shaping. And overall with the sculpture, you begin to notice that everything is twisted and sort of contorted. So there's a kind of tension that's happening throughout the sculpture that's probably mirrored in my tension in trying to hold the pose and sweating and shaking a little bit. So for me, there are all these kind of entry points just through the physicality and trying to kind of put the body into these shapes that have been made by Gaudier-Brzeska. This is Boy with Uplifted Arms. I think it's a really interesting depiction of a kind of sort of masculine sculpture. Now this pose I think is really interesting in that obviously you've got these uplifted arms, but the sort of shape that they form, and there's this extraordinary sort of right angle that's created by the elbow, which when you try and do the pose, you realise that again, the arms must be really long to create that sharp angle. And it's not necessarily about it not being anatomically correct, but it's also pushing with the body what shapes it might kind of create. So for me, that was a really interesting sort of challenge to try and think through how you might create this kind of halo. And I was thinking about this idea that the arms kind of make this halo around the head, and the gapping's quite important. And I know in mine, when I tried to do it, I couldn't quite get the gapping right because this sculpture is very much presenting out. So it's kind of almost like there's a kind of audience, or there's an awareness of being watched, which I think is quite interesting when you look at it. And when you get into the pose, there's that sense of holding a pose. And then one thing I think that I thought was quite interesting is actually what the legs are doing, because it's this upright pose. The sort of left leg is sort of stable, and then the other leg is slightly bent. I think there's this thing that I remember from Renaissance sculpture, like Michelangelo's David. I think it's called contrapposto, which is the thing in like classical sculpture about different parts of the body being under tension and relaxed so that you get different forms kind of sort of going on. So that was something I was kind of really aware with. So this one leg straight and then one leg bent also throws your hips out. And as you can see along the side, there's this kind of very sort of sinuous kind of curves that come through. So it's quite a sensual sculpture, although it's quite blocky and sort of masculine, there is a kind of sensuality to it that I think I'm sort of quite drawn to. This is Mermaid, and I think it's one of my favourite sculptures. Coming up to it close, you really notice this sort of contorted kind of position of the mermaid's tail and body. This is probably one of the ones that I've learnt the most about from trying to reenact and re-perform. Partly because it was pretty much impossible for me to do this pose. So there's a very strange thing in that the lower half of the body is like sort of full in profile, and then it sort of twists around the middle so that you see on the sculpture the mermaid's front, her breasts are exposed. So I've just kind of approximated it, but it makes me really appreciate this kind of curve, serpentine curve of the body. And then there are these things that are kind of happening with the hands. The one hand that's kind of sort of tucked underneath by sort of indicating towards the face. And then most tortuously, the other arm that kind of is over the body. And again, they sort of frame the sculpture really nicely, but when you're doing it, again, it's just really super awkward to kind of hold that pose for any period of time. And I think I'm pretty drawn to this sculpture because there's a kind of emotional resonance with it. It feels almost kind of quite sanguine and sad. But also I think from doing it though, there's a sense actually of kind of tension and twisting. I'm sort of wondering, is actually the figure in pain, in agony? You know, maybe that's just me kind of projecting from trying to do it, but it's not the serene or restful sort of sad, quiet pose that you might imagine when you begin to start to put your body into it. But yeah, I mean, I think again, it's sort of an example really with Gaudier-Brzeska, I think, of really not necessarily anatomically, realistically trying to capture the body, but trying to think about how the body might convey a certain like emotional resonance through almost this idea of trying to push it to express more. It's really fascinating. So this is Seated Woman. Of all the sculptures by Gaudier-Brzeska, I think in a way this one has a kind of resonance similar to some of the other works. It's referencing African masks. And again, you know, there's this whole kind of tradition of early modernist works, Picasso, Braque, Cubists, kind of being influenced by kind of African art at that point in the early 20th century. So I guess for me, there's a kind of conversation with like representations of blackness and African figures and African motifs with this work. One of the things that I was really thinking about was this kind of shape that's created when I was trying to perform it with the arms. So like the hand on the elbow, and then this other hand resting on the neck, sort of creating this triangle. So there's a kind of sturdiness to it. And I think for me, the top half is a kind of, with the face, seems quite serene or almost perhaps even spiritual. There's something very kind of ritualistic about this pose. Again, it's not naturalistic. It's very highly constructed. And I guess there's a conversation to be had about, you know, Europeans projecting into, I guess, fantasies or delusions of kind of African culture. There's a whole kind of colonialist narrative that you could read into ideas of primitives, obviously that are totally kind of outmoded now. But so for me, I'm coming to this from a very different perspective to what Gaudier-Brzeska might have done. There are a few other things really as well from the pose, from trying to do the pose that I really learned. One is that the bottom half, I just gave up. There's a kind of, feels like it's kneeling. I mean, in a way, there's not much detail on the bottom half. There's maybe one leg going under the other, but there's almost a sense of kind of being quite upright, which my body just can't do. So I sat cross-legged and really tried to focus on the upper part of the body in this sort of elevated kind of structure. And again, I think with a lot of Gaudier-Brzeska's work, there's a kind of emotional resonance that sort of comes out with these. It's a woman. I'm really drawn to the kind of thickness and broadness of this body, the kind of strength of the body that's kind of conveyed through the pose and these big arms. In some ways, it's quite an androgynous. Some of his sculptures are quite sexualized, particularly the women, but this one isn't. Ultimately, it represents a kind of strength and power, which sort of draws me to it. And I think it's a kind of complex and engaging sculpture that makes me really think about this representation of a Black female body and what that might mean now to me, to you, to us. Dancer by Gaudier-Brzeska is kind of the sculpture that's probably least suited to my body type. But in the selection of sculptures that I've chosen, I think it provides a kind of stark contrast, I think, to, if we think about the kind of Seated Woman or the Redstone Dancer, Even the boy uplifted, these kind of very sort of thick, strong bodies. Here we've got a sort of very sort of classical ballet-esque, long-limbed female figure. In a way, it's a maybe more naturalistic sculpture in terms of sort of capturing this kind of balletic movement. There's a whole thing about balance. And again, from doing the pose, everything is about balance. So this back leg, sort of crouch down, knees bending, everything is very sort of precise with this sculpture. That's one of the things in sort of trying to kind of replicate it. You realize like the fingers are super specific. Even the gaze of the figure, sort of that kind of sort of looking away, is very specific. It becomes very much like a kind of sort of study in kind of like this sort of modern classical dance. And in a way, for me, it doesn't have necessarily the emotional resonance of some of those other sculptures that, in a way, speak to that looking towards kind of African sculpture or other traditions of sculptural making that so many of the kind of modernists were really interested in. It's really interesting to try and step into this pose, which is much more about kind of choreography. Taken with all the other sculptures, I'm really sort of minded of how Gaudier-Brzeska is really interested in the sculptural potential of the body. Obviously, he's using different materials to capture that, but in trying to use my body to look at these depictions of other bodies, I'm really aware of the potential of the body to speak through movement, position, and posing, and the potential of the body to really communicate and transmit emotions, psychological states, and even just interesting shapes and forms.